Hello, and welcome to a special edition of the LifeWorks podcast. Joining me today is longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Marisela Martinez-Cola, an assistant professor of sociology at Utah State University. Her areas of research include race, ethnicity, and culture. She's the author of soon-to-be-published The Bricks Before Brown, which is a study of race, class, and gender across 3 school desegregation cases involving Chinese, Mexican, and Native American plaintiffs, which took place before Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. Dr. Marisela Martinez-Cola, it is a pleasure to have you on the podcast today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Mark. I appreciate that.
So let's jump right into it here. Tell us about your book. Tell us about what led you down this path, and how relevant your work, not just in your book, but in your broader research, how relevant that is to what's happening in the world today.
Absolutely. Again, thank you for having me on, and I'm really happy to be able to talk about my book project. Right now, it's under review at 2 academic publishers, so fingers crossed. Hopefully, I'll get a contract soon. But it was my dissertation project, and to give a little bit of context, this PhD is my second career. Before that, I'm the first in my family to go to college, so I'm classic first-gener. So I went to the University of Michigan, and I majored in African Studies. And then, like every good first-gener, you either go to business school, engineering, medical school, or law, right?
Right.
I stink at math and science, so that knocked 3 out right away. There's no way.
Right. Yeah.
But I could argue well, so I went to law school. But again, I didn't really understand fundamentally what lawyers did. So when while I love the study of law, I didn't like the practice of it. And so after a year, I ended up interviewing, and I received a position at Davenport University, sort of as head of their diversity affairs, right? And I think sort of it all kind of prepared me for that life and that moment. And the way that I ran the offices for about 10 years, I worked in multicultural affairs, sort of on the administrative side of the university house, right?
Right.
And the way that I ran the office was, I called it rigorous inclusivity, right?
Nice.
Where I
like that.
Yeah, thank you.
I
just looked around the table and I said, who's missing from this conversation? So that it wasn't sort of, and you hate to use a violent analogy, but it wasn't sort of a rifle approach to things. It was a buckshot approach. To try to sort of, reach as many people as possible and try to bring as many people to the table when it made sense, right?
Yeah. So
I say that because I always would research things, particularly from the 4 largest sort of racial populations. So, when I looked at beauty, for example, when we were going to talk about beauty, I looked at issues of beauty in African American communities, in Latinx communities, in Asian American communities, and in Native American communities. And the differences were amazing, but the similarities were even more, to me, more so. And so kind of years of doing things like that, that's the way I just sort of developed the way I thought. And I could not just do one thing.
Yeah.
So when I went to get my PhD, I had already knew what I was going to study, because I had this folder that I collected all this information that I learned. And it was in a manila folder that said I wrote PhD on it. And I was looking at school desegregation, right, which combines, which uses my legal knowledge. And as I was researching it, I also learned about Mendez v. Westminster, which is a Mexican-American case that happened in 1947, before Brown. And so I said, I wonder if there's the equivalent of those cases in Asian American and Native American communities, because that's kind of how the law works. The law works, it counts for us too, and you have to sort of do that. And so then I found the Chinese American and Native American cases, and then
Wow.
kind of kept going down that road. So the book looks at those three cases in particular, and they're all based out of California. And I just kind of look at them side by side. And from 1885, which is a Chinese American case, Tate versus Hurley, to 1924, which is a Native American case, Piper v. Big Pine, to Mendez v. Westminster in 47 and Brown in 54. The similarities across the cases were remarkable. And so the differences with how they dealt with race and in the law was really, really fascinating to me as well. And so, I wanted to be able to, one, tell a story that a lot of people didn't know about. They don't realize that those cases even existed.
Right.
Yeah, and I wanted to be able to tell sort of a more inclusive narrative of the civil rights movement.
Yeah, right.
In all its, in its sort of ugliness and beauty, because the cases involving non-Black plaintiffs are not, necessarily pro-Black, right? There were some really sort of a lot of instances of anti-Blackness in those communities, and I felt like we needed to talk about that too, and not just sort of paint this rosy kumbaya, it's a small world after all kind of thing, but to tell as much of the story as I could. So that's a long explanation, but that's ultimately kind of where the genesis of the book came from.
And what I think what's stunning about that is the amount of time and the number of cases that it took to get to Brown in 1954. I mean, we're talking you said well over. I mean, from the late 1800s. So this is in excess of 50 years, to get this kind of case heard before the Supreme Court. That's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, almost as soon as the school started, segregation started happening almost immediately. And it's sad because that's not why the school system was created. It was actually created in the spirit of unity. But almost immediately. And so one of the first cases is in 1848 in Massachusetts.
Wow,
so
look at that.
You look at it's almost, 100 years, almost 100 years of that battle. And it was with a young girl in Boston, Massachusetts named Sarah Roberts. And so I love pointing out that the struggle kind of began with a little girl and ended with a little girl, and so,
How beautiful that is, right? So
I love the story.
Yeah. So how is your work, not just in this book, but also your broader research, how is it relevant to what's happening today? There's so much social unrest. I mean, we're looking at, riots and looting and protests in the backdrop of a pandemic environment. Tell us about your work and how it's relevant to what's happening today.
I think, the work that I do is based on this idea of understanding racial inequality in the United States, right? And one of the reasons why I like to do a comparative approach is to be able to validate the experiences, particularly of African Americans, particularly Black people in the United States, right?
Right.
Because it's very easy, and it's often been argued, oh, they're just complaining, they just, do this, that, or the other. But in my courses when I teach, I'll start, with sort of the kind of the black and white binary that everybody understands, right?
Right.
And that gets critiqued a lot. But then when I show them, guess what? These sorts of things also happen in Latinx communities, in Asian Americans, and Indigenous Native Americans. When they start to see that it starts to happen across the board, right? Then you have to start to ask the question, what is the common denominator, right? And it shows how efficient, the efficacy really of white supremacy, that it's able to course through all those communities in a variety of different ways, not in the same way. There's not an equal sign between the experiences of these populations, in no way.
Wow.
There's definitely a hierarchy here, a racial hierarchy in the United States. But the fact that it appears, when you see, if a disease appears in one population, then there's something going on in that one population that you need to sort of look at. But when it starts to rear its ugly head in particular populations, and it's going, regardless of geography, regardless of wealth, regardless, then you need to start asking a different question. Yeah.
So can you give us a historical contextual perspective on what led up to George Floyd, that situation?
First, this situation really is so interesting. We used the phrase unprecedented to describe a pandemic, and now it's being used to kind of describe the protest, right? And what's happening is that people are beginning to really believe that this isn't just something that's happening to quote unquote bad people,
Right.
And they're starting to understand this is something that's deeply, deeply rooted all the way from the times of slavery. Black bodies and Black people have been policed incessantly, right?
Wow.
From slave patrols that would go and capture runaway slaves for plantations, punish runaway slaves. That is so from the very beginning, they were over-policed, right? And then after slavery, you had sort of this kind of brief moment of maybe things were gonna get a little bit better, but then you get the creation of Jim Crow laws, right? And then these other laws, these sort of Black laws that ended up, again, policing Black people's behavior in the United States, right? And so, there were laws against loitering. There were laws against, just things that could be easily, sort of prosecuted in a sense. And so there's a really great book called The New Jim Crow and a wonderful documentary called The 13th Amendment. And what it talks about is the 13th Amendment abolished slavery except for prison populations, right? And so shortly after Jim Crow, right, you begin to now, instead of enslaving African Americans, you can just incarcerate them and you get the same thing basically. And so that occurs throughout from the end of slavery till 1965, where theoretically things are supposed to be equal, right?
Right.
And so you've got these years of a built-up system in place where African Americans are just monitored almost and painted to be criminalized, in a lot of ways. And then you look at the movements like the Civil Rights Movement, and people have seen those recordings. They've seen those photographs of police officers, beating down peaceful protests, German shepherds attacking their dogs, water hoses, and all throughout time, police were at the center of a tremendous amount of violence that happened against Black communities. So the lynching is a really big part of that. These vigilantes would be able to go and get African Americans out of prison, or out of the jail wherever they were arrested, and drag them out. And the police stood by, or the police sanctioned it, or the police participated in it as members of the KKK. So it's just it's a really ugly is an understatement. It's a history that when you understand it, you can explain why there's this deep, deep distrust of police officers in particularly in Black and brown communities. But the focus here is mostly in Black communities. To serve and protect was not, that was never a motto that African Americans were necessarily familiar with, right? It's to sort of, patrol and keep down was, it was a different motto for them. And so, I could keep going. You look at the drug war and the over-incarceration of African Americans for that. And so now you have, all these Black men and women who are sitting in prison for, because of the 3-strike rule that Clinton created for small offenses and particularly for, like, let's say marijuana. But now you have people in California and Colorado profiting, off of being able to sell marijuana, and they're still sitting in prison serving their time for a crime that is no longer a crime anymore.
Right, right. And why do you suppose that the African American population in particular is singled out? Is it because of this long-term culture that's been in place, this long-term policing?
Yeah, absolutely. Drug rates happen at approximately the same rate within Black and white populations. So it's not the idea that, Black people commit more crime. It's that they're being policed more. So they get caught more. When I teach at universities, it's really funny because when I was at Emory University, we have this thing called fraternity row, right?
Yeah, sure.
And I would ask them, and of course this is a very wealthy, affluent, predominantly white institution, and in my class I would say, let me ask you this question. If the police officers were to go down fraternity row, let's say on a Saturday night, how many arrests do you think they would make that are related to drugs? And the class just started kind of laughing, right? Because they're like, oh my goodness, they don't even have to wait till Saturday night.
Right.
To find it. It's a culture that's there,
Sure.
And then I said, well, if they don't, if they know, and everyone knows what's happening on that
Right.
Fraternity row, why aren't they going? I mean, it's low-hanging fruit, right? And that's a really awesome conversation to have with students because they start to realize when you have resources, you can get out of things much better, much faster.
Right.
So their parent who's a CEO of whatever has the resources to pay for an attorney to make this go away.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
Whereas in a lot of Black communities, that's not something that exists. And you wish justice was blind, but it's really who can pay the better price that end up sort of getting out of it. Another example is the opioid epidemic, right?
Right.
Years ago, there was the crack epidemic, right?
Mm-hmm.
That happened. And what happened in that case, it was a criminal matter. And so people were getting, particularly, and it really affected poor Black communities. And so African Americans, again, were being arrested at outrageous rates when what they needed were the services to help with addiction, right? To help with being able to find jobs. And it was a criminal matter then, but right now you have an opioid epidemic, which is affecting largely rural white populations, right? And it's a health crisis is what it's shaped as, right?
Wow.
And you don't see that the incarceration rates are not happening as much. Instead, you have people, poor towns who are investing huge amounts of money in this thing called Narcan that revives people who have overdosed on opioids, right? So it's the idea of saving lives at all costs possible. And then they need help. And so those go to drug courts to try to beat this addiction. So I think that when you compare and contrast how one population gets treated over another, and that's kind of where I think you really have to start looking at it a little bit more critically.
Yeah. So as we look at what's happened recently, the death of George Floyd, obviously, he's not the first African American man to die at the hands of police, even on television, right? What's the significance of this moment? Why is it that his particular death has set off not just a nationwide outcry, but a global outcry? What's the significance of this moment, this particular death? What is it?
Yeah, I've been reflecting and thinking about that. I'm a scholar of social movements. Is what this is called, kind of what's happening, right? Where a collective gets together and says something is wrong and we need to point this out, right?
Right.
And so I've been thinking, what makes George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor different than Tamir Rice and Eric Garner and Sandra Bland? What makes this circumstances different? Because they were, of course, video. There was, a lot of the same things. And honestly, I think it's time.
Mm.
you know, what's happening is that we're in a pandemic where young people are out of school, largely, you know, out of school. And you have a massive unemployment rate. So you've got a lot of people who don't necessarily have to report to work. And this is across the board, right?
Right. Right.
So they can protest on the weekend, but they can't protest, you know, 9 to 5 on Monday through Friday, right? Now they got
Right.
the whole week,
Right.
right?
Right.
To be able to kind of see this thing through. And it's time in the sense that people have time to think about it, to reflect, right?
Right.
Because you're sitting at home and you're not, you know, working on the next project. You're beginning to see that there's something bigger going on here, and you're beginning to ask more questions. Celebrities, they're not recording, you know, they're not doing recordings, they're not making films, so they have much more time on their Instagrams and, you know, Twitter feeds, and, you know, to sort of influence
Yeah.
people. And so they're able to kind of spend more time on that front as well. And the other aspect of time is people witnessed a murder when they saw George Floyd.
Right.
It was a straight up murder. Everything else, all the other sort of videos were sort of parsed down to a few seconds.
Sure.
So it's really easy to say, oh, that happened so quickly. You know, they didn't expect that to happen, or the police officers, blah, blah, blah. Here, it was nearly 9 minutes of watching a man beg for his life,
Right.
of watching people standing around begging the officer to get off of his neck.
Right.
And the officer just very coldly and even glibly remaining, you know, in that position.
Right.
So I really believe that the big difference is time. People have time now to really think about this.
Yeah. What about what about the protests? But even beyond the protests, what about the violence and the looting and the unrest? Like, what has, so it's one thing to protest, right? And I think that's absolutely sanctioned, right, by, you know, by the First Amendment. But what about the violence, the riots, the looting? You know, where does that come from? Is it just opportunistic, or is it a justified action? Is it a justified response to what has happened? I'm curious to know your thoughts about this. And the protests are one thing, but I think what's come out of the protests, this other stuff. Tell us about that. What do you think is, you know, the source of that? Is it justified? You know, what does it accomplish? You know, all those things.
Absolutely. You know, I think that it's, you know, I've always been, whenever sort of, because, you know, these riots, of course, riots / revolutions, whatever you want to call them, happened before, right?
Yeah.
And there's usually some sort of element of, you know, violence and fires burning down buildings and things like that. And this one is particularly, there's a lot of it going on.
Right.
And I've never been a believer that it was necessarily the organizers of the protests that were doing it. You know, I think that there are individuals who are coming there that, see an opportunity to be able to take advantage of sort of what's going on.
Right.
And I think also there are a lot of people that are coming out to protest that have never really been taught, in a sense, how to protest. And so,
Right.
you know, and I will say,
right.
You know, I will say that they sort of kind of lost their minds a little, you know, and just have gone crazy, you know, gone nuts, you know. And so they're spray painting and they're knocking out windows. And it's remarkable because there's all these videos on Twitter and Instagram of individuals, of people, young people who are white, young white people who are, you know, spray painting. And there's this, you know, sort of, you know, guy dressed in black with a black umbrella. It's a white man who was going around and breaking the windows of an AutoZone. And and there's all these people, saying, what are you doing? Like protesters that are telling them, stop, you
Right.
need to stop doing that. And, the person's like, they're talking about how this is their way of protesting. And the person that was recording said, they're not going to blame you. They're going to blame us,
Right.
for this.
Right. Right.
I was in Salt Lake City, I live in, Utah. In Salt Lake City, there was an overturned car, and this white woman walks up onto the car.
Yeah.
And proceeds to show her distrust or distaste or hatred or whatever for the police by relieving herself.
Right.
Car, right?
Right. Right.
And they're like, yeah, that's not what this is. That I think it's interesting because you're like, why would she do, like, what is that?
Right.
Where in the much are you taught? Yeah, go and do number 2 on a police car. That really shows how much that. And so I really think there's kind of this split between people who truly don't know and understand what a peaceful protest is, and they just don't know what to do with their anger, right? Whereas people of color have experienced this anger and frustration for years.
Yeah.
So it's not something that, and so yes, if there are people of color, and when there are people of color who also participate in the looting and also participate in the violence, that I believe comes from a form of anger and frustration and just, tired of being tired. Fannie Lou Hamer said that at, the Democratic National Convention. And I think that it's amazing because people are like, why are they burning down their own neighborhoods? And,
Right.
I had to make the point that that's not their neighborhood. This isn't theirs. People of color, generally speaking, we don't own things, we rent, right? And so this isn't their neighborhood. This is a neighborhood that, they've sort of been shuttled into for years, even in the home ownership rates among people of color. So it's not like literally owned necessarily, although that's a part of it as well. But it's about this idea that this is not my community necessarily. And so I think that the looting is something when people sort of criticize it, I don't think they fundamentally understand what drives it, because at least there's something you can kind of point to, right?
Right.
In the meantime, there's a really great article, I think it was in the New Yorker, that said when white people riot, and it just shows all these photographs
Right.
of people. Like there's one about a Huntington Beach after a surf competition, just fires and buildings just collapsed. In Denver 2014, they rioted because their football team lost, and in San Francisco 2012 they rioted because their baseball team won.
Right.
In Vancouver their hockey team lost. So you see it after all these major sports events, right?
Sure.
Just, people losing their mind, and largely white populations losing their mind, right?
Right.
But people aren't like, and they're upset about that, right? But the way that it's written about is that they just got a little overzealous.
Right.
They're just a little too enthusiastic about what they're doing, right?
Yeah.
And so I just think that the way it's framed, we need to step back and say, okay, why can one group do it and it makes complete sense to people, and another group does it and they're all of a sudden confused?
Right. Right. So what is white privilege?
That's a biggie. White privilege is sort of these unearned benefits that people receive based on the color of their skin, right? The reason why I say people is because there are many people of color who are very light skinned or who pass for white, who also benefit from that sort of privilege as well. And so what it means is that it can be anything from the really big things, and it's mostly the quote unquote sort of small everyday things, right? So a person that has white privilege doesn't have to worry about when they move into a new neighborhood, they're more than likely going to see people who look like them, right? So they're not going to worry about, oh, will this community accept me, right?
Right.
When they walk into a store, they're pretty much assured that they're not going to be followed, around the store to see, are you stealing something, right?
Yeah.
When they get pulled over by the police even, your first thought isn't, oh my gosh, they're going to kill me, right? And for the cops, as much as they, the cop show, one of the things that I've noticed is, there's this one show where this white man was just like yelling at this police officer, calling him everything but, his God-given name, everything on the planet, and the police officer stayed very calm, didn't, sort of do anything. And I was like, that's white privilege, because if a Black or brown person or a person of color were to do that, they would be dragged out of that car so quickly, right? And so I think that there's some things that, there's a benefit of the doubt that's given because you are a part of the majority population, and that majority population sort of wrote the rules. And we can't possibly think that you would necessarily break them, right?
Mm-hmm.
White privilege is, white meth addicts getting drug court and going to, get help, whereas the jails are filled right now with Black men and women who succumbed to crack addiction. Mm-hmm. So that's white privilege.
Wow.
Yeah.
What can people who are not of color, I'll say white people, okay, what can they do to genuinely, honestly, and earnestly show support for those, for people of color?
Yeah. There's so many things that they can do. It's really interesting because I was talking to a student and I was telling them that I've developed 2 answers for people. There's some people that will ask, what can I do? And I think that they sort of want something immediate to make them feel less bad about a situation.
Sure.
And so I'll just recommend one book. I'll say, you can read White Fragility, you can read how to be anti-racist, I'll just give one book, you read that.
Right.
And I think it makes them feel like, okay, I did my part, right?
Right.
The ones that I know are serious are the ones that are really going to take the time to learn. And then I give them this other resource that has much more information on there, documentaries, videos, interviews, things to really help them understand the history behind this, to help them understand that African Americans, in the United States, have been at war in a sense, right? Yeah. And what's happening is that, and it's happened right under our noses, and people don't recognize it as that. And white people are finally starting to see there's a lot of casualties that are coming out of this. Right? Out of this war. But they're joining it now. African Americans have been fighting it for years. So they're not shocked when these things happen anymore. But white people come into the battle, right at sort of one of the kind of the high points, and they're just completely and utterly shocked. Yeah. Because much of their white privilege has blinded them. They don't have to see it. They don't have to look at it. And so when they finally do, it's very jarring, and so I think that there's some people that want to feel better now. And then there's other people that really want to make a change and understand that change starts with them. Mm-hmm. So I think you have to educate yourself and you have to put in the time. People of color have had to learn how to navigate in a white world. We've been taught our entire lives how to do it, right? Right. White people have not been taught those skills, right? They don't know how to adjust themselves accordingly because it is that world. It is their world in a sense. Right. So, yeah.
How does a person? Is it enough for a person to have a few Black friends, a few Latin friends, a couple of Asian friends, and get along well? How does a person know if they are, to use a popular phrase, woke? If they are truly enlightened, if they are truly not a racist. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. How do they know that? How do they know that for themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the goal is to the goal is not to not be racist anymore.
Right.
That's not the goal, right?
Mm-hmm.
The goal is to be proactive against racism. So this is where the phrase anti-racist comes about.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's saying there's something going on here and I need to make a contribution, not just, you know, there's something going on here. No, I see it. Thank you for showing me.
Right.
You know,
right.
It's like there's something that needs to change, and they're an active part of that change. And as I said, it begins with them. So, you know, if it were the case that a lot of white people had those Latinx friends and Asian friends and Black friends,
Right.
then I think that would actually help a bit. But what ends up happening is they have that one Black friend, or they have that one Latino friend. Like, I joke around and I tell people, I am certain I'm the one Latina friend to like about 50 people. So when they say, oh, I have this Latina friend, you
Right.
know, I'm positive they're talking about me, right? And so I think that it's really fundamentally looking at, you know, how am I raising my children? Not this idea about being colorblind. Am I teaching them to be color brave? You know, who are the people that sit around my table? You know, what are the books that I'm reading? What are the TV shows that I'm watching? What are the messages that my kids are getting from their television shows? Mm-hmm. You know, you look at something even as popular as the Avengers, right? That's out there. For the longest time, you had Captain America and, you know, Tony Stark, and Disney, I don't think were prepared for the Black Panther and how popular a bunch of little white kids going Wakanda forever. They weren't, you know, they weren't expecting that, right?
Right.
And so,
yeah.
You know, I don't think they realize how, you know, it's this idea of what is being represented as good and pure and contributory to this world.
Right.
Is that the, you know, the world I want my child to live in? And then, you know, it's at school saying, you know, it's more than just saying, you know, you need to ask them, what are your punitive policies here? You know, what are the statistics when it comes to who's getting punished more? You know,
right.
Black students or white students? You know, and I can tell you, it's Black students. You know, because the over-policing starts in school.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, have your teachers received anti-bias training? You know, asking those more change-worthy questions. The issue is it takes time to get to that point, right?
Right.
When you get woke, it meant you were asleep. So you missed a lot, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But when you wake up, there's a little bit of work you have to do. And once you kind of clear the webs out of your head, you know, then it's time for action. So it's not just about waking up. It's about waking up and doing something.
Doing something. Yeah. How do you think the media has handled all of this?
It's really, you know the phrase, if it bleeds, it leads, right?
Yes. Yeah. Famous. Yeah. Media.
Very famous line of what makes the newspaper.
Right.
Right. And I think that when it comes to sort of the looting, the media purposely focused on those pictures, those images. They don't see the videos that, you know, sort of, you know, amateur reporters have been, you know, recording on Twitter. You know, they don't release them that say, you know what, we need to question who's really behind, you know, these matters. But I think they're starting to kind of understand because they have been attacked, the media has been attacked more in this protest than I've ever seen. You know, there was a CNN reporter who was arrested on television. There was another one that was, you saw the police officer shooting rubber bullets, you know, at her, and you can hear her in the background just, you know, screaming in pain because she's getting hit by, it was shocking to her because she's part of the media. It's a protected place. You're not supposed to touch them, you know. And so I think that they're kind of getting a little bit of a taste about what's, you know, happening. But the media is drawn to sensationalism, right? And they'll like, you know, they like what looks pretty. right? And so they'll have those shows of like police officers kneeling or, you know, in solidarity with
Right.
people. They like the one shot approach, like let's try to capture this moment, and you know, rather than really being much more comprehensive about it and showing the good, bad, and the ugly.
Right.
And so I think that the media can do better. I mean, all of us can do better, right?
Sure.
But I think that it's such a powerful medium, they should be doing better. It's their responsibility to do better. And I think that you have to stop thinking and, oh, this is a good story, into, no, this is something that's really going to help educate people.
Right.
You know, this is,
right.
You know, this is the right story, so to speak, you know. Yeah, so I it's good, it's both good and bad, right? And I think one of the other things that I'm struggling with right now too is how many times all these videos are now coming out, right? Because police officers are realizing they're getting, you know, initially I just really don't think they care. I don't know, but you know, video after video after video of all this violence, you know. Right. I don't know how, and they're saying, you know, beware, this is a disturbing video, right? I believe that secondary and tertiary trauma is real, you know, and what people experience with the George Floyd death, the George Floyd death is a collective trauma, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there has to be more responsibility. You have to talk, if you're going to show these things, you need to be able to talk about the mental health consequences of them as well.
Right.
You know, so I just think it can be a lot more sort of responsible and educational, not sensationalist.
Right, right. Well, and to be honest, it's not good for business for them to be balanced, right? They're not in the business of reporting peace and love and harmony. Like it's actually bad for business. It doesn't get people watching, right? So, you know, it's it's not in their best, strangely, it's not in their best interest to be fair or right or just in their reporting. Just my own personal observation. But so hopefully the media will take the message, right? But if they don't, what can we do as consumers of media to filter to filter what we're seeing? You know, how do we view the media? Because ultimately, I feel it's a personal choice. We control what comes inside and how we process that. How should we be taking the media in?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And it's a good instinct about the idea that it's not good for business. That's absolutely 100% true. I agree with you on that. I think that you need to supplement sort of this visual media with, I believe, more print. You know, that it's the print media that generally has a bit more information that you're able to parse through and able to learn. They're the ones that are quoting studies, and they're the ones that are interviewing experts, and they're the ones that are, you get what I'm saying? And so, you know, you find the ones that make the sense to you. New York Times is outstanding. They do a really great job of reporting, and when they mess up, they say they mess up. With the understanding that there's Vox News and sometimes BuzzFeed has some really interesting things that I think are happening more in the social media sort of internet realm. That's more telling. You know, that actually, you know, there are people that are learning more from those, you know, those clicks, right. those links, than they are from TV. There's people that are learning more from John Oliver and Trevor Noah, than they are from, you know, because they're able to go a little deeper into an issue, into a topic that the media can't capture in a 5-minute segment. Right.
If you were to sit down with our national leaders and give them advice on things that they should focus on going forward, what advice would you give them?
You mean like our national leaders right now?
Right now? Yeah. If they were open and they were willing to listen, what would you say to them?
I don't know how open our leadership is exactly right
Right, right,
now for that. So it's a little bit more difficult to imagine. But to the change makers, the people who have the power to change,
right, right.
they need to understand that their influence and their power makes a difference, right? And that, again, they have to ask the very basic question that I knew how to ask at a university when I was at a multicultural affairs. Who's missing from the table? You know, if I'm going to create this law, if I'm going to, who do I need to have there sitting
Right.
with me to help inform me about what's going on so that I can make the best possible decision out there. And so this is a policy that so many people have always had. You know, CEOs know that you need to surround yourself with the people who understand the business
That's
in
right.
order to be successful.
Absolutely.
Right? That's a very clear lesson that's business 101.
It is
Yet they
indeed.
don't do it when it comes to policy, right? They don't do it when it comes to implementing legal and substantive change, and so I think that's why, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was so refreshing to have, in Congress, because she
Right.
represented the people. She came in with a completely different perspective and she is tearing it up. She's asking the tough questions. She's, saying you need to, there's a whole reality out there that you, Mr. CEO, who has your golden parachute, that you, Mr., I've been in, government for umpteen thousand years and have somehow become a millionaire. I mean?
Right.
I've lost along the way.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's a problem when you're going to serve the people and you become a millionaire while you're serving the people. I'm like, I don't know. Anyway.
Funny. What are you hoping that people generally will take forward with them as a result of this entire experience?
Several things, on a personal level, just a commitment to personal change, but understanding the power that they have in making institutional change, right? If the person that is in office right now, because people don't understand the power of local politics, right? If
Right.
your local,
Right.
council person, you have the power to vote them out. You have the power to put in people there that are going to reflect your values. Just recently here in Logan, small town Logan, the city council or the leadership voted to go green. And they want to ask the state officials, we want to go green. We were on the New York Times because we were number one on the spike in COVID cases.
Wow.
You don't want to be number one.
Right. Right.
In this small area alone.
Right.
Because of a meat plant, right? There's a meat packing plant here. And 6-1, 6 people said, yeah, let's go green. That makes sense. Let's, because they're tired of wearing masks and they want to go shopping and they, and I sat there, I was like, yeah, that's not who I want representing me.
Right. Right.
We need more people like the person who voted, the one person who stood up against all of that. So I think that understanding not just your individual power to change, but also the power of your vote, of being able to get out there and be active and really understand the issues that are happening. In November, we're picking a president, but it's all these other elections along the way that are just as, if not more important to what's happening with you and your communities.
Right, right. How do you intend to leave the world better than you found it?
Thank you. I love teaching about race and ethnicity. I love trying to teach my students how to be color brave, to teach them that it's okay to talk about these things. That it's good to talk about race and inequality. because, my philosophy, and I say it a lot, and it came from a quote. I wish I could remember where I got it from, but I remember it just resonated with me. And the individual said, we have to move from you or me, right? So it's either you or me. One of us has to win.
Right.
There's a united you and me.
Yeah.
Like we can do this together, which is beautiful as well. But the real transformation happens when you move to you are me, right? When when my life is transformed by your life, when I recognize that when you hurt, I hurt. When you hunger, I hunger. That's what I want to ultimately teach my students. That's, and I have to do it for me to make sense of all this because it can be very disheartening. I've realized that my space is in the classroom, one person at a time. I often tell people, have you ever seen that there's a movie, Shawshank Redemption? Right?
Yeah, great movie.
Yeah, and it's a movie about Andy who was falsely accused and went to prison, and he digs himself out of prison, right?
Right.
And with a little bitty hammer, okay? And I tell people, we're all Andy Dufresne, trying to, chisel out of this massive institution that's been created, and, you do it with your little bitty hammer with the understanding that because you have been in the institution, you're forever transformed, right? Andy was a different person coming out of that than he was going in, right? And so, if that's how I feel like I'm Andy with my little hammer, making my little tunnel. But if there's enough Andys, if a bunch of people became Andys, that building would collapse really quickly, right? But that's where I see sort of I've had to see my mark, and I hope I make a mark. And my students have been so lovely during this time. I can't tell you how many emails I've received from students who have shared that the class was transformative for them, that they are so glad they're able to understand what's going on today because of what they learned in the class, and that they're able to have tough conversations with their family members that they didn't feel like they could have before, but now they know how to have them, and so that's, to me, you're planting seeds. You don't quite know what it's going to grow into, but that's just all you can do, so I hope that whatever my little part of what I've planted, will help to make the world in some way, a better place. Hopefully that person will be able to know. I always tell my students, once you know better, you do better.
Absolutely.
Right? I'm not gonna blame you for something you don't know, that you're not familiar with. But once you know, then, you can be held accountable for that. So,
right.
Yeah.
And I think you've certainly scattered a lot of seed in the time that we've had today. And I think that's a beautiful way to end our conversation. Where can people find you and connect with you online?
Sure. I have a website. It's www.michicanaphd.com. I call myself a Michicana because I'm a Chicana from Michigan. So that's kind of my handle.
That's great.
Yeah, at Twitter, I'm at Michicana Forever.
Yeah.
And and just in general, through the USU website, people can contact me. I'm more than happy to talk about issues. I've been doing that a lot.
Right.
And I think for those, if I can, mention one other thing, I recently authored an article called Collectors, Nightlights, and Allies, Oh My, White Mentors in the Academy. And there's a lot of people who are in positions of power who are mentoring a lot of young people of color, or people, not just young, but people of color who are out there.
Right.
And I wrote this article because I don't think mentors realize what they're doing some of the time, right? They're very well-meaning people. And they unintentionally can be maybe condescending, and so I talked about these sort of three typologies of the kinds of mentors that get out there. And people have found it very helpful. I've had white readers write to me and say that it really made them think, and it's helping them to understand their position in it all. And I've had people of color email me and say that it's very validating that, I'm able to finally put words to their experience.
Right, right.
To be able to say, oh my gosh, that's what I can call that person now. That person was a collector because they just seem to like to collect, They're this sort of cadre, of people of color that they, sort of collect. It's really interesting. But anyway, to be able to, maybe read that, it's a small thing. But if you're in a place where you're mentoring people, even in business, I wrote it for the academy, but it seems to be translating really well to other areas too. That's a small start, especially if you're responsible for helping to shape their trajectory in whatever world that you happen to be a part of. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing all that you shared today. It's been such a pleasure having you. And I have a feeling that you're going to be pretty busy here in the near future in a good way. So thank you for sharing some of your wisdom, your experience, and your knowledge with us. And I wish you all the best, going forward in all of your research, your work, your publishing, and everything that you're pursuing. And I look forward to following you in the future.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity, and we'll love to take any questions. And I'm a professor. I'm a teacher. That's what I do. So I hope that some of this has helped to maybe help people look at something a little bit differently. So thank you for the opportunity.
Of course. My pleasure indeed. Of course.